Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel and to another YouTube video. In today's video, I'm going to be going over the planes of motion, their associated axes of rotation, and understanding why having an understanding of these different planes of motion is essential for building exercise programs and everything. So let's get right into it. So, what are the planes of motion? The three primary planes of motion are the sagittal, which divides the body typically into right and left halves, the frontal or coronal plane of motion, which typically divides the body into front and back or anterior posterior, and the transverse plane of motion, which typically divides the body to superior top and inferior bottom. Now, each plane of motion has its associated axis of rotation. The axis of rotation is pretty much the axis of which an object rotates, that's usually perpendicular to the plane. So now this might be a little bit of a stretch here, but one way I like to sometimes think about it is if you think about like the right-hand rule with the solenoid. So we have the electric current going up this way, and we have the electromagnetic field kind of looping around. That's kind of, I'll get into it why, but it's one way that I've kind of remembered some of the axis of rotation with the plane of motion. And then at the end here, I'm gonna talk a little bit about different kind of plane of motions that are a little bit secondary to the primary planes of motion. So the sagittal plane of motion typically divides the body into right and left halves, and it has an axis of rotation in the medial lateral axis. So if you want to think about it, like some common exercise like this are flexion and extension. So we can think curls, tricep extensions, leg curls, even just hinging forward and then going into extension like that. A lot of those kind of motions are associated with this plane. But what is the axis of rotation with this? So the way I like to think about it is if you were to take like a line that went straight from my shoulders here like that, and you were to have a flexion extension, that is essentially the axis of rotation that goes on here. So sagittal plane, we're thinking right and left halves, so we're cutting the body this way, but then our plane of motion is our plane of, excuse me, our axis of rotation is going perpendicular to the plane. So the way I was describing it before, picture like your current is going through the shoulder here, and we're doing flexion and extension motions like this, right? We're bending forward and extending. That is kind of the way I've remembered the axis of rotation, or one way I kind of like look at it. It's essentially just a plane, or it's essentially just an axis that is perpendicular to the plane that of which pretty much an object rotates around the axis. Next up, we have the frontal or coronal plane of motion. So this typically divides the body front to back, and it has an anterior to posterior axis of rotation. So think about it like this way. We have the line going through the middle, anterior to posterior, and a lot of these motions are like abduction and adduction. So if you think like jumping jacks or you think like side lateral raises, a lot of those motions, abduction going out to the side, so further away from the middle line of our body, adduction coming in, so it's closer towards the midline of our body. So that's kind of the frontal or coronal plane of motion, and its associated anterior posterior axis of rotation. Next up, we have the transverse plane of motion. So this typically divides the body from top to bottom or superior to inferior. The axis of rotation associated with this plane of motion is the longitudinal axis of rotation. So if you were to take a line and basically go like this, kind of almost like similar to the sagittal plane of motion, except this is the axis of rotation. So if you were to take a line that went straight down the middle line of my body like this, and if we were to do exercise that involved rotation, so if you look at my hand here, almost think about like this way, electric current going down here, and then the electromagnetic field wrapping around. The magnetic field wrapping around almost like resembles the axis of rotation, basically. So think about it like we're doing golf swings, we're doing Russian twists, we're hitting a baseball, right? So kind of movements like that where we're incorporating a lot of rotation out of the upper or lower body. That those are kind of the movements that are associated with the transverse plane of motion. Now you can make arguments for like the oblique plane of motion. There's a lot of different kind of planes that are usually secondary or tertiary to these kind of planes, but these are the three primary planes of motion that we look for. And then again, parasagittal, like we were mentioning before, this is more of like a secondary plane to my knowledge. So we have the mid-sagittal plane here, which is dividing the body pretty much into even right and left halves. We have the parasagittal plane, which is essentially the same thing, except what you'll see is that when we divide it, it's the uneven sides. You might even see like a median plane, which is if we look at the hand here, the plane of motion might be going through the middle finger and might be dividing the exact midpoint of your hand. That's another one that I've seen before, but for the purpose of this video, we want to look at the three main planes of motion. So, conclusion. When we are writing up an exercise program or we are looking at just exercise in general, it's pretty important to consider and try to attempt to implement all different planes of motion. We want to strive to build capacity and strengthen all ranges to reduce our risk of injury as best way or as best as possible. Excuse me. Now, each exercise listed here doesn't always perform in just one plane of motion due to the fiber orientation. So if you were to look at like a squat, for instance, right? You may think like a lot of flexion and extension out of the knees and the hips and all that kind of stuff. I know I mentioned that before, but that's just one way that we can kind of introduce the different planes into different exercises. However, the knees don't only just move in the sagittal plane of motion there. Let's say when you are going in, when you're trying to extend your knees, there is what we call the screw home mechanism between the tibia and the femur, where we are doing kind of a rotation out of those movements. So we're getting a little bit of axial rotation, right? So not everything is just one kind of plane of motion. We need to consider all of it, especially when we look at fiber orientations. Like let's say you take your rectus femoris, which is one of your quad muscles. We have the pronation angle of the muscle going out to the side, like kind of like in this oblique pattern. So what you'll see is we're not only just doing flexion extension or rotation with that, there's a multitude of different planes that kind of muscle operates in or should operate in. So when we program exercise, we want to be able to incorporate all of those. So in conclusion, there's three main primary planes of motion. We have the frontal or coronal plane of motion, which divides the body anterior to posterior. We have the transverse plane of motion, which divides the body typically superior to inferior or top to bottom. And then we have the sagittal plane of motion, which divides the body right and left halves. And then we have the associated axis of rotation, which is pretty much perpendicular to the plane of motion. So if you think of it like this, we have the plane of motion here, the axis of rotation here, and it's basically just doing these, right? Now, like I said before, the solenoid thing with the right-hand rule, that might be a little bit of a stretch, but that's kind of one way I've attempted to try and remember the axis of rotation. It's actually helped a little bit. So if that helps at all, then I'm happy to help out with that. But in general, I hope you guys enjoyed this video as much as I'm making it. Leave a comment if you would like, ask a question. I'll try and get back as best as I can. And yeah, thank you guys for watching, and here's to getting strong. Thank you.